Hypothetically, would a true hourly rate be a good thing or a bad thing for drivers? It's something you should think about because the federal government, as well as several states, are trying to make it a reality. We're talking about it because the federal government is trying to implement it, and one of the largest metropolitan cities in the world, New York, is trying to expedite it. California saw AB 5 and then Prop 22. Wait until you get a load of what Connecticut's trying to do, because that's an entire thing right there. So stick around for that. While no other state has a Prop 22 by name, we are seeing several other states trying to mimic it. And the scariest part yet is under the new Department of Labor rules, we all could be classified as W-2 employees. With that said, the purpose of this video is to start a conversation on if a true hourly rate would be in the driver's best interest. This is one of those videos that isn't going to work without your participation. The only wrong opinion is the one that's unvoiced, so use that comment section liberally. Hey, can I start with Connecticut instead? What the f*** not? Let's start with New York City. Before we get too far into the video, what New York City is proposing is not just for DoorDash and Uber Eats drivers, but rather gig drivers as a whole. And this is a video where I'm probably going to pose more questions than answers. These questions are being asked to get a conversation started. And to have a cohesive conversation, we first need to understand what these various cities and states are proposing. So, with that said, let's talk about New York. To give you some background, a group of gig workers known as this group, or the United Delivery Workers. Please forgive me for butchering that. I want to stop here for just a moment. Regardless of my personal thoughts on what they're asking for, I do want to give them props for organizing behind what they believe in. Get this, the data that they collected indicated that drivers were only earning about $11 an hour in New York City, and that includes tips. New York drivers, chime in the comment section and tell me if there's any truth to that. However, as a result, in 2021, New York City passed a law that would be implemented by 2025 and would guarantee gig workers a minimum hourly rate. They estimated that approximately $24 an hour plus tips would be a fair wage. At the time, it was one of the first laws of its kind in the nation, and it seemed like a big win for the drivers. But since then, things haven't been going so smoothly. Months of infighting and lobbying have caused a divide amongst politicians and some of the group members who fought for this change. City councils reduced the amount from almost $24 an hour to $19.96 an hour, and that is still to be fully implemented by 2025. Many drivers and some lawmakers have accused the city of bowing to pressure from the gig apps. They feel like drivers are exposed to dangerous conditions, such as increased chance of robbery, violent crime, and inclement weather. They also argue that they have to pay for their own gas and frequently end up waiting at restaurants, which reduces the number of orders that they can take. And while these points are valid, there's always two sides to every argument. Let's take a look at the other side. The gig apps argue that an hourly rate would hike up costs for everyone. And it would be natural to assume that these added costs would be passed on to the consumer, resulting in fewer orders. If you've been watching my videos for a while, you'll know that I don't have much sympathy for the gig apps. But having said that, there needs to be a balance where the service is affordable for the customers and therefore there's enough work for drivers. Sitting in our car for hours on end while not taking any orders and getting paid for it would not last long. In summary, this would cause less work for delivery drivers, making hours increasingly difficult to come by. Let me know in the comment section if you agree with me, and if you don't, let me know what you could see happening. Interestingly, some drivers, including some former leaders of the group, have joined the gig apps in pushing back against this legislation. They say that the minimum wage scheme is a mistake that will backfire on drivers. Many would be pushed out of the industry entirely as a result of a reduced need for drivers. Shifts would be harder to come by. Drivers currently enjoy flexibility with their hours and do not want to compete with other drivers for the best slots. Now, it's up to the New York City Council to decide what they're going to do with this situation. Now, I want to take a moment to discuss the people who helped get this passed and then later backpedaled. Why would they do that? Are they shills? Over the last year, I've learned how to negotiate, and typically with negotiations, you ask for a lot more than you plan on getting. In my opinion, just getting these companies to the table is half the battle. I don't know the numbers that the drivers were presented with, but clearly at some point they saw something alarming enough to make them step back and reanalyze their position. In my opinion, no, they're not necessarily shills, but saw a potentially bigger problem that this could have created. Remember, customers order because it's convenient, and most people don't think twice about spending $30 or less. But if costs balloon to the point where customers have to start factoring in their other bills before deciding to order, that's going to affect the number of orders we get. And I don't need to remind you, but fewer orders means less drivers are needed. This would result in hours that are increasingly difficult to come by. What are your thoughts on what's happening in New York City? Let me know in the comments section. Now I'd like to move on to Connecticut. There is currently a bill heading to the House in Connecticut that, if passed, would see delivery drivers earning $36 an hour plus $1.30 a mile before tips. Look, after reading comments from politicians on both sides of the spectrum, it's pretty clear to me that neither side knows what drivers really want. It seems like you have one side who says they chose the work, so fuck them. Meanwhile, the other side is trying to massively overcompensate. And with that massive overcompensation comes a huge price to us. In the interest of full disclosure, I couldn't find many answers to the questions I had about this bill. So the information you'll hear moving forward is my interpretation of the proposal. From what I've gathered, drivers would be assigned schedules from the various gig apps, and our ability to go online whenever we choose would be up to them. Don't forget, most gig workers do have a full-time W-2 job and do this on the side. So what does that do to their side hustle? Let's move on to the $36 an hour. That's almost $300 a day, assuming you're working for 8 hours. But is that active time or online time? I don't know. I couldn't find an answer. If you know the answer to that, please leave it in the comments. And that right there is the problem when the government starts to intervene with gig workers. They do not understand what we do and what it is that we want. And therefore, it can create gray areas that can then be used to exploit us. But I digress. That almost $300 a day is before tips. That works out to be about $1,500 a week, $6,000 a month, or $72,000 a year. There are people with master's degrees who are earning less than that. And before somebody goes and twists my words, yes, base pay in most markets is poverty, but $36 an hour would ensure that no one orders. This would be an incredibly short-lived victory for drivers. If this law is implemented, I can see DoorDash, Uber Eats, Grubhub, Instacart, Lyft, all of them packing up and leaving Connecticut. I believe that this bill could effectively kill gig work in that state entirely. What good is a pay increase if we enjoy it for a month and then lose the gig entirely? And additionally, with the gig apps assigning you a schedule, there's no guarantee that you're going to get any hours, and if you do, that it's going to work with your existing schedule. And let's not forget the influx of new drivers when they find out that they can make $72,000 a year. This is a bubble that will burst, and likely sooner rather than later. Don't get me wrong, I'm all for fair and reasonable compensation for drivers, but there is no balance there, and it would likely destroy the job altogether. After all, let's look at this from the perspective of the customer, because if there isn't a customer, there isn't a job at all. I live in Bellingham, Washington, which is about 20 miles from the Canadian border, and from time to time, I find myself in Seattle, and let me tell you, the traffic to get there is not pleasant to deal with. Sure, I could fly from Bellingham to Seattle and then catch an Uber around the city, but this would end up costing me a couple of $100 at least. So instead of acting like I have more dollars than cents, I drive myself and deal with the traffic. I want you to put yourself in the shoes of a customer in Connecticut. These apps are already expensive. In a lot of areas, a Big Mac meal delivered to your door could set you back almost $30. And as we all know, some people do pay that. But what do you think the likelihood is that the existing clientele would be willing to spend $65 on that same Big Mac meal? Something that would cost them less than $10 to go and get themselves. I'd argue nobody in their right mind would do that. Hell, I'd walk 3 or 4 miles to my closest McDonald's before spending that much to get it delivered. And I'm a driver who believes in supporting other drivers. In my opinion, this legislation is a massive overreach that would have disastrous consequences for everybody involved. What are your thoughts? Let me know in the comments section below. If you're not on board with an hourly rate, I've got some bad news for you. Recently, the Department of Labor proposed, then adopted a rule change that will likely see gig workers classified as W-2 employees. They did this despite the outcries from tens of thousands of people across multiple sectors. Rather than the government getting involved and destroying it for everybody, why don't they just give us full transparency and let us make educated decisions? What do you think? Is a true hourly rate a good thing for gig workers, or will it ultimately lead to less opportunities for us? Let me know in the comment section. A couple of times throughout this video, I've mentioned the federal government getting involved. I've done a detailed video on that, and it's definitely worth checking out. If you want to watch that, you can click on this video. Well guys, that is going to about wrap up the video. If you haven't done so yet, please do consider pressing the like and subscribe button. My name is Zach. Take care.